Hello, welcome back. Today I'm going to show you how to bind a quilt. The binding method can be used for lots of things with straight edges, clothes, mending stuff. In this instance, it's how to do it on a quilt. And first of all, you will need a quilt that should have been finished for Christmas, or any quilt that you need to finish actually. We'll just not say anything. So this was a present and it did get wrapped up for somebody and I had to take it back so I could finish it. So here you can see this is the edge of the quilt, and then when I layered it up to do the quilting, you always have a little bit extra. So we need to tidy up this edge first of all. So I'm going to cut it off using a rotary cutter and a ruler. I'm going to show you two methods for doing this. The one that we'll do first is with scissors and pins, and then the one that we'll do second is with the rotary cutter and the ruler. So you need to pin along your edge to hold it in place, but not too close that you distort the edge of the fabric. I do appreciate that not everyone's got rotary cutters and cutting mats and all of that sort of thing. And this is perfectly adequate because no one's going to see this. And as long as it's straight-ish, it should work out just fine. So I'm just going to do this little bit. Right, and it's starting to distort up there with the pin, so I'm going to stop there and do it the other way. Unfortunately, you can't have pins under a ruler. Make sure everything's sort of smoothed out. It should all be tacked in place anyway if you've been quilting it, or have the quilting to hold it in place. So match up the rule to the edge of the fabric, and you'll see that some bits stick out and some bits don't. So it matches up here and it matches up all the way along here, so that's what I'm going to trim it to. And it doesn't matter how brilliant a quilter you are, it happens to everyone. And then move your quilt down and carry on doing the next bit. Just work around the whole thing until it's all done.
This quilt's still got its tacking in from the quilting, so sometimes that gets pulled with the knots, so just chop those off as you go around so it doesn't distort the quilt.
Right, so quilt is trimmed, and I'm just going to sort out any corners like this. You can see that it's kicking out at a bit of an angle, and whilst it's really small at the moment, as soon as you put the binding on, anything like that will just be magnified and it will be really noticeable. So I'm just going to give that a teensiest little trim and check the other corners as well. And the best way to see if a corner's square or not is if you've got a cutting mat, line it up with the lines. Honestly, who can't remember what that's called? And that is square, so that's good. So it's been trimmed. I've checked it's as square as possible. I've got 3 layers of fabric here, so things move all the time. So now you're just going to pin this, because the way I do bindings is I go and stitch about 1/4 inch line of stitching away from the edge. And just holds everything in place. And sometimes, if I know it's going to go through the washing machine a lot, I'll actually zigzag it as well. Right, so we have pinned it all the way around to hold it in place, but we're going to put that to one side and I'm going to show you how to make the binding. So to make your binding, first iron your fabric, which I clearly haven't. We're going to cut a 2.5 inch strip off of the fabric. That might seem really big, but it's going to be double around the edge. I'll show you anyway. So I'll line that up along there. This is a 5 inch wide ruler, so I know it's exactly half of this. So there's another strip. So we've got 9 strips altogether. This is literally all the fabric I have left. So this is going to be ample. You'd be surprised how much binding you can make even out of a fat quarter. And there's all sorts of ways of just sneaking a little bit more if you need to. If you need to make it 2 inches instead, you could offset the fold like that and then just stitch that bit down, and then you've still got all the raw edges contained. But we're going to fold ours actually completely in half in a minute. But first of all, we need to stitch them together, and we need to stitch them together with a diagonal seam. So what we're going to do is put a corner on a corner like that. So using a 45-degree angle, matching up this one with the edge of that one, and then we're going to draw in biro, because nothing else is going to show up on this, one line across there. That is the stitch line. To hold that in place, which way am I going to stitch? Oh, I don't suppose it matters. To hold that in place, we need to put a pin in here, then sit it down again, make sure it's flat, and then put in a pin in here, and make sure they're a reasonable distance away so you can get the sewing machine foot between them without having to take them out. Right, so when that's stitched, what happens is you unfold it. There's a pin holding it at the moment. You unfold it and then you press it, and then it's pieced on the diagonal, and that's so that the bulk is shared. Rather than stitching it across that way, all of that would match up with that side. Going across in the diagonal like that, it means it's shared across a distance. So what you need to do is then flip that as though it was the right side. Have that one ready to attach the next piece. So you take the next piece, put the right side to the right side, match it up on the corner, draw your line. And if you keep going in the same direction all the time, you won't end up with any bits stitched on back to front. So, and just keep going like that until you've got however many pieces you need. Obviously all quilts vary in size. So now you've drawn all of these lines and pinned all the corners, you need to stitch them all. So the way we're going to do it is the chain stitch method, which means that you start off sewing, and when you get to the end, you find the next seam that you want to sew, and you start feeding that in. And for something like this, where you've got lots of these little corners, which is really important that they actually meet up to the edge of the fabric, it will stop the chewing up of the corners. I don't have a very brilliant machine, but even on a good machine, sometimes you'll lose those underneath. It's just the feed dogs will just grab onto it and sort of roll it back on itself. When you finish stitching all of these together, snip each one apart and get your aesthetically pleasing pin cushion. Take all the pins out. So now I'm going to put this on one side so that I can stitch the edge of the quilt where we pinned it earlier on. So I'm just going to throw that over there.
So I'm stabilising the edge of the quilt by sewing a 1/4 inch straight stitch from the edge. And what I realised by the end of this side in particular, you might not be able to tell, but the quilt is backed with a brushed cotton, which has a very definite nap to it. So one way it's like trying to stitch over a brush, and the other one it's like trying to stitch silk. So that way, by the time I got to the end, to the corner, it had used up an extra nearly 1/2 inch of fabric. So I had to do some judicious trimming, and then decided instead of straight stitch that I would zigzag to ease the fabric through, and that did work quite well. But then on the other long side, which was again had a nap to it, I had to turn the whole quilt over so that I could feed the uneven amount through by the feed dogs, because obviously I'm not using a walking foot which would feed all the layers through together. I'm just using a normal sewing machine, so the feed dogs are always going to feed the bottom layer of fabric through faster than the top layer, which really doesn't work very well. But this worked out fine. It actually came out perfectly. So I literally stitched halfway down, turned it over and stitched from the other end, and they met up in the middle and it was fine. No puckering, no weird little bobbles, nothing.
So back to the binding, and we need to find each of these bits where we stitch down to make a diagonal line. So, and then stitch one side. Just naturally wants to sit to one side anyway, and iron it. Scissors and cut it off. And go on to the next one. So you just sort of pull one strip away from the other and iron it and trim it. So now you're going to fold it in half. So what this means is where it's round the edge of the quilt or a bag or whatever, it's going to provide a bit of protection and sturdiness to the project, because it's the edge of the quilt that gets the most stress and the wear and all of that sort of thing. Just go all the way along and just keep ironing it in half. And because we've cut it true to the grain, which I didn't mention when we were cutting it, that is just the way you'll end up cutting it off of a square piece of fabric. It shouldn't wander around too much. So this is not a bias binding at all. So there's the binding. I've coiled it up because it'll help keep it out of the way while you're using it. But also, if you didn't want to do any more, but you wanted to have it ready next time you were doing something, it'll keep it tidy, and it also sets this edge really nicely. So the next thing I'm going to do is pin it to this. So you need to leave a tail of binding at least about 8 inches. It's so that you can have plenty to play with when you come all the way around the other side to join this up. You need a little bit of space. And then you're just going to put these two edges together and then pin them in place. Try and be as precise as possible, but honestly, don't worry about it, because we're going to stitch down here in a minute and turn that over, so you're not going to see anything. So when you get to the end, put a pin in at an angle like that. There's the end, it's just slightly in. Make sure the binding goes all the way to the edge, and then we're going to put in place what will become, it'll look like a mitered corner. It isn't, but that's what it'll look like, and that's what we want. Don't worry if you've got an extra bit, because as you work around the quilt when you're sewing it, you can just move it a little bit, but the main thing is to make sure you've got enough on the corner. So, and then just pop a pin in like that. See, so there should be a extra bit of fabric there, and then carry on pinning. So I just want to show you that corner thingamajiggy again. So hold it tightly, put a pin in at an angle, and the pin's not right on the corner, it's just to one side. Pull your binding to the edge at that corner and then sort of ease it round, so you're making a little triangle flap there, and then pin that in place. Right, I've pinned it all the way around. That's the taily bit, and so I'm just going to cut this off. It probably doesn't need to be this long, but I'll look at all that binding that's left. You could use that on the top of a bag or something. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this to the machine, and I'm actually going to start stitching from about here to leave all of this space, and then I'll finish at that black pin. That's a really good marker actually. And then it means I can finagle the binding so we can stitch that together, and then I'll stitch that last bit on. But I'll show you that whole thing as I come to do it.
So as you get to the corner, stitch the binding all the way to the very edge of the fabric. Not over, not under, all the way to the edge. Stop sewing, clip it off, and then turn your binding through 90 degrees to make that 45-degree triangle that you can see. put a pin in it and then start stitching from the very edge of the top again, using a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, and you'll end up with a perfect corner. Okay, so when you've got to the end of your sewing, you've got 2 flaps. You need to overlap your flaps and then mark a 2.5 inch square on both of them. I would watch this. If you're going to do this, I would watch it and then watch it back again and then have a go. And then you cut off one end and cut off the other end, and you've got one 2.5 inch square that will overlap completely. So you open it out, then open out the other one, put the right sides together, mark a diagonal stitch line. I've tried it out with a pin first to make sure I've got it going the right direction. And then I also tacked it in place just to double check that it was right before I sewed it, because it's got a tendency to pull apart anyway. And then take it to the machine and stitch it. And then trim off the excess, and then you can just finish up that last bit, and then that's your binding stitched on the machine, and that's the last bit of the machine sewing that you need to do. When you're binding the quilt by the end bit by hand, fold it over, and when you get to the corner, you push the fabric all the way to the edge and then fold that little triangle back over itself. And then I like to, when I'm whip stitching it, actually I think it's more of a catch stitch, I don't know, I'm not very good on terms. The stitch that I do, where you hide the long stitch in between all the layers of fabric and then come up with just a tiny little stitch to hold the binding down, that's the one I'm doing. When you get to the corner, just go over the corner and catch all the layers together and do 2 or 3 little stitches, and it just hold the whole thing together. So this is the finished quilt. It was made just doing the squares out of strips method. Completely bound and finished. We won't say anything about the quilting because that's not finished, but anyway. Thank you for joining me again. I hope if you want to bind a quilt that you find this useful. I wish there'd been the same sort of resource for me to use when I first started quilting. And also, thank you so much. I'm up to over 200 subscribers since my last video, so how exciting is that? Really, really chuffed, and hopefully as the channel continues to grow, we'll get more and more subscribers and get a little bit of interaction going on with Instagram. Anyway, I'll be putting a video up soon, and have a good one. Bye.